Oh, it's creating
sur les appareils.
static.
Physique.
I simply want to introduce another example for discussion. We don't even need to develop it here. When it comes to my presentation this afternoon, we might consider other kinds of examples, but I'll simply throw out the example now of human sacrifice. We tend to forget this was an almost universal practice. At least it was a very widespread practice around the world, so far as we know. At some point, people stopped sacrificing their children. But it was, if not a cultural universal, it was a very widespread practice, but more importantly, it was at the center of religious practice. It was the religious practice of many, many civilizations and religions. If we want to get back to the primeval gods, if we want to get back to the original myths, we should reinstitute human sacrifice. Why wouldn't we do that? That was really the primordial practice. Presumably, we would all agree. We all disapprove. I don't think we even need a show of hands. We all disapprove of human sacrifice. But that was the ritual practice. Now, the point is obvious. Are we to say we don't tolerate, we cannot accept, we do not recognize that practice that was a practice, that was a central religious practice, that was the defining ritual practice for many of the cultures of the world? It seems to me just a step down the line to say we can not approve of X, Y, and Z because it comes in the general context, let's say, again with clitorectomy. Well, I'm not an African. Well, it's their culture. Presumably, we have suffering people in front of us, and those real cases are the cases, presumably, that are should determine our judgments. And so I tend to agree with the tenor of the intervention so far, that those kinds of concerns, I think, override the generalizations that we've heard so far.
Sont formidables parce qu'en même temps tu as respecté la parole de ton maître et en même temps tu as présenté ta propre parole, et ça je crois que c'est un exercice très difficile. Bon, maintenant, ceci étant dit, sur la question des droits de l'homme, je voudrais ajouter juste un élément qui me semble très intéressant, un témoignage qui est apporté par quelqu'un qui est vraiment transculturel par sa vie, qui est André Chouraki, qui est un Israélien, que vous savez, qui a eu des fonctions très importantes dans l'État d'Israël, et qui en même temps a eu des cultures françaises, né en Algérie. Bon. Et cet homme a participé de près à la Déclaration des droits de l'homme, à la naissance de la Déclaration des droits de l'homme, et dans son dernier livre, Les 10 commandements, il apporte un témoignage très intéressant, des discussions très chauffées qui ont eu lieu avec René Cassin, qui était un peu le cerveau de la Déclaration des droits de l'homme. Et André Chouraki et d'autres, bien entendu, lui disent « Mais qu'est-ce qu'on fait avec les droits de la transcendance ?» René Cassin qui répond, bien entendu, je sais que j'ai omis ça, bien sûr, je sais que c'est une omission très regrettable, mais est-ce qu'on peut faire mieux maintenant? Et dans tout ce mieux maintenant, il y a la clé, je crois, de ce que tu dis, c'est-à-dire d'un abus extraordinaire que moi je traduirais dans mes mots, de l'abus du transfert de l'universel vers l'universalisme. Je crois que c'est pas simplement pour être rigoureux avec les mots, mais je crois que les mots ont un sens très profond là. Qu'est-ce que je veux dire par là? Il y a une universelle qu'on peut postuler, que ce soit les droits de l'homme et du sacré, les droits de l'homme et de la transcendance, peu importe les noms qu'on adopte. Mais au moment quand on transforme ça en universalisme, c'est là qu'il y a tous les dangers dont on commence à parler ici. Et je crois que le pire des universalistes, qui est caché dans cette déclaration des droits de l'homme, si elle est appliquée d'une manière qui n'est pas transculturelle et transreligieuse, ça sera qu'on transforme l'homme dans l'homme consommateur, normalisé d'un universel qui est celui des marchés uniques. Et ça, je crois que dans une discussion sur la transculture, il faut le dire. Voilà. Et j'ai juste une question, dernière suggestion que je t'ai faite, ça serait intéressant que dans les textes écrits, tu fasses une petite réflexion sur la différence entre l'universel et l'universalisme. Le transculturel est universel, mais il n'est pas universaliste. Voilà.
Laissez-moi des choses. Laissez-moi parler moi très brièvement. Bon, avec ce que disait Steven, je suis d'accord que les cas concrets nous amènent à mesurer toute notre généralisation. La seule chose que je me demande, c'est pourquoi les cas concrets que normalement sont mis sur la table appartiennent à un certain côté. Dans d'autres mots, il ne me semble pas moralement acceptable comparer le meilleur d'une culture avec le pire d'une autre. Si on compare tout. Alors ce que j'invite, c'est que dans ces cas, on soit disposé à amener des éléments qui soient beaucoup plus nuancés dans les choses. Je dis ça pour la dernière partie de ton intervention. Pour la première, je n'ai rien à ajouter, me semble tout à fait évident ce que tu dis. Je ne prends pas une relativité pour tout accepter, mais pour essayer de tout comprendre. Et il y aura des choses qu'on n'acceptera pas. Non. Merci Bassarab, je vois que vous n'avez pas perdu votre perspicacité. Non. Et c'est rien de ça que j'ai tenu parole d'être fidèle à ce que j'ai appris de mon maître et en même temps être cohérent d'exprimer ce que cet apprentissage m'a provoqué en moi. Vous l'avez très bien vu et je vous en remercie de le mentionner. Tout à fait d'accord avec la différence entre universel et universalisme, et j'en tiens compte pour le texte, j'en prends note et je vais m'en souvenir. Et je vais vous donner un exemple qui s'est passé l'année 93, au mois de février à Montréal, dans une tempête de neige. J'ai soupé avec une amie africaine du Sénégal, docteur en sociologie, qui travaille à Dakar, dans un restaurant africain à Montréal. Lui, comme bon africain, il me racontait des histoires, mais ce soir-là, il voulait me narguer, il voulait même me provoquer, et je le ressentais. Et quand on commençait à manger les poulets avec la sauce des arachides, il me dit, tu sais, Agustin, chez moi, c'est au nom des droits humains qu'on est en train d'imposer la société de consommation. Moi, je pense que le souper s'est coupé dans mon ventre, non? Parce que c'était trop pour moi. Non? Je dis, bon, arrête donc. Bon, je sais que tu es provocateur, Emmanuel, Sengui plutôt je l'appelais, mais dis-moi pas ça. Et alors, avec toute une série d'histoires que je ne rentrerai pas maintenant, oui, il m'a amené vraiment vers le terrain qu'il voulait, c'était au moins me questionner comment un outil qui pourrait être très valable, décontextualisé et universalisé comme tel, d'une façon abstraite, devenait tout le contraire de ce pour lequel il avait été généré. Au-delà du fait du droit de la transcendance. Non? Que je pense que c'est vraiment une omission. Alors, je suis occidental, je suis peut-être malgré moi assez moderne, mais j'essaie de voir par tout ce questionnement que je vis depuis au moins 10 ans, de trouver la juste mesure entre la validité universelle. Parce qu'il y a une chose que je n'ai pas dit, pour ne pas prendre du temps, mais que vous me donnez l'opportunité de le dire. Toute culture est universelle, non universaliste. Et sans référent universel, il n'y a pas de culture. Mais c'est comme si nous serons maintenant dans un cloître, dans le premier étage, on regarde les jardins d'un cloître, on voit tous les jardins. Mais les jardins qu'on voit, c'est différent. Parce qu'on ne peut pas atteindre, il n'y a pas de perspective globale. Une perspective n'est pas globale, sinon elle n'est pas perspective. Elle est toujours partielle. Non? Et je peux ouvrir un peu plus avec des efforts, mais je n'ai pas 360 degrés. Mais ça ne veut pas dire que ce que je vois est faux. Non, c'est réel. C'est le tout. Mais ce n'est pas le tout du tout. Si on peut dire quelque part.
En français En français, alors. Merci, Agousti. Je voudrais te remercier pour ton intervention et je comprends mieux maintenant tes appréhensions. Je sais ce qu'il en coûte de s'asseoir sur un cercle de parole avec des Amérindiens. Et je voudrais dire ça pour monsieur, là, qui disait que nous sommes ici dans un espace protégé. Voilà. S'asseoir dans un cercle avec des Amérindiens en Amérique du Nord, je ne connais pas l'Amérique du Sud. Voilà. C'est s'asseoir face à des violences et avec des gens qui sont en train de mourir. Et c'est pas s'asseoir dans un espace protégé. J'ai eu l'occasion aussi j'en parlerai ce soir, un petit peu d'animer un cercle de discussion entre des gens du quart-monde, du mouvement athée des quart-monde et des universitaires. Et nous avons souvent vécu la même chose que Augustin nous racontait, c'est-à-dire qu'au nom d'une certaine idée des droits de l'homme, il y avait la proposition qui était faite finalement aux plus pauvres était de sortir de leur milieu. Et ce que les gens du quart-monde réclamaient, c'est que l'ensemble de la société rentre, vienne avec eux, ce qui est complètement différent. Et j'ai trouvé, bon, je ne m'exprime pas très bien, mais je suis assez ému là, une grande analogie avec ta sincérité en allant apporter les droits de l'homme aux Mohawks pour la défense de leur et le dialogue qui s'ensuit pour comprendre qu'ils ne peuvent pas accepter ces droits tels qu'ils sont formulés au risque d'évacuer les droits enfin pas le droit mais la grande paix, ce qui rejoint les droits de la transcendance. Voilà, je voulais te remercier.
En français, anglais. Écoutez, il me semble que, afin de pouvoir voir clair, nous devrions retourner à ce que je peux appeler l'essentiel, c'est-à-dire les niveaux de réalité qui veut dire en même temps niveau de perception. Nous devrions chercher à comprendre beaucoup mieux, chacun de son côté, ces niveaux de perception. Les développer, les comprendre et les utiliser. Parce qu'à ce moment-là, tout le discours sur n'importe quel sujet devient plus clair. Il y a plus de transparence et je crois avec la transdisciplinarité, ce que nous cherchons avant tout, c'est cette transparence dans les choses, de ne pas se tromper, mais de voir plus loin et de voir pas seulement au-delà, mais à travers les choses. Et il me semble que dans tous ces discours que nous pouvions avoir ici, ces niveaux de réalité, ça devrait aider à chaque personne de comprendre et de chercher dans ces niveaux de perception, les développer chacun pour soi-même, pour que nous puissions avoir un contact avec tous ces discours, tous ces problèmes que nous pouvons avoir. Merci.
Très brièvement, je vous dirais, je ne suis pas sûr que la réalité soit transparente. Je ne suis pas sûr que je sois transparent à moi-même.
faut chercher la transparence.
Je ne suis pas sûr qu'on ait besoin toujours de la transparence de la réalité pour la vivre pleinement. Ceci dit, selon un certain niveau de réalité, sûrement qu'il nous faut une certaine transparence, dans la mesure qu'on n'en fait pas un objectif absolu. Parce que la réalité, elle va nous jouer de tours, toujours, et elle va nous échapper. Parce que je pense qu'une des grandes sagesses, au moins ça je l'ai compris avec ma mère hindoue et mes contacts avec mes amis mohawks, c'est qu'il faut apprendre à accepter même ce qu'on ne comprend pas. Ça m'a pris du temps. Alors je dirais que plus qu'essayer de rendre transparente à tout prix la réalité, c'est plutôt de rendre transparentes nos intentions face à la réalité.
C'est une transparence intérieure.
Même la transparence intérieure, je ne pense pas que ce soit un absolu, sincèrement. Que ce soit une donnée de base nécessaire en soi. Je préfère parler non pas de la transparence de la réalité, comme de la transparence de nos intentions. Savoir pourquoi on est où est-ce qu'on est et de quelle façon on y est. Si la réalité devient transparente ou non, j'en sais rien. Peut-être que oui, peut-être que non.
Je voudrais parler très rapidement. Est-ce que je vais conclure très vite, mais je crois que une des choses qui a soulevé un petit peu mon émotion, c'est le courage de parler des différences. Et je pense qu'il faut qu'on réfléchisse sur le droit à la différence, sur le droit au changement, si on veut parler du droit à la transcendance, dans le respect de nos limites physiques et psychiques. Je crois que dans le respect de notre intégrité physique et psychique, il faut le poser, mais parler de la question du droit à la différence et du droit au changement, sans lequel nous ne pouvons pas grandir avec les Indiens et eux ne peuvent pas grandir avec nous. Et si on n'établit pas cette possibilité du droit au changement, la loi n'évolue pas, les hommes n'évoluent pas, c'est-à-dire c'est la question je crois que c'est une question philosophique fondamentale.
Merci. C'est tout.
As palestras da tarde, essa palestra é do professor Steven Wasserstrom, que vai falar sobre revelação e revolução buscando uma história das religiões. E eu vou pedir que ele fale um pouco sobre si mesmo, sobre a sua pesquisa, local de trabalho, etc. Então, Steve, please.
Thank you. I'd like to talk informally. You hear me okay? I'd like to talk informally for a few minutes to start with. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the work I've done more generally in the history of religions to try and provide some framework for the lecture I'm going to give. After the lively interchange this morning and the growing wealth of ideas that are already on the table, I had some inclination that perhaps we should just open it up for discussion, and I would contribute informally from my particular disciplinary perspective some observations. But I think we'll go ahead and I'll go ahead and deliver my published talk. But before I do that, and I think they're going to bring in a podium because I like to stand when I talk. But I want to say just a few words about my background. It might help make sense of the sense I'm trying to make. I'm a historian of religions. I have a chair in Jewish studies. Much of my training is in Islamic studies. My advanced graduate studies are in Arabic and Islamic studies, and most of my scholarship is as a medieval Orientalist. I have several identities in a sense, although they're not inconsistent. And what I want to do is explain how those identities fit together as a way of moving towards the lecture I gave today. that I'm going to give today. The talk I want to present was precisely designed for this event as a kind of, because our very kind and gracious and hospitable organizers were familiar with my last book. And rather than repeat that, I want to try and go one step further. To make real sense of that, I think, in other words, I need to say a few words about what I did in this book. Another way of saying it is how I got here, why it makes sense that I'm here, so that you'll have a little more framework for my remarks. My original scholarship concerned the relationship between Jews and Muslims in the early Islamic period. Now, as many of you probably know, the Jewish community under Islam in the first centuries of Islam, up until the 13th century or so, enjoyed a very rich and complex and mutually beneficial relationship with Islam and with Muslims. The general consensus, which I don't dispute, is that Jews and Muslims enjoyed what has been called by one of the leaders in the field a creative symbiosis. My first book concerned the creative symbiosis between Muslims and Jews between the 8th and the 10th centuries. Now, I was attracted to this problem as a historian of religions not because of the difference, not because of the distance, but because Jews and Muslims shared so much. On virtually every level of analysis, the form, the content, the function of these religions, a single monotheistic God, incorporeal, who delivers a single legislative message in the form of a holy book, which is then delegated to an authoritative reading community. This whole form of the religion is more or less identical between the two traditions. And as you well know, the content, the prohibition against the eating of pork, and a variety of other particulars are also shared between these communities. Finally, the sacred history of the two traditions are also shared, right? They trace themselves back to some of the same chain of prophets. Form, content, and function of these traditions is very close. And in fact, Jews and Muslims in the first centuries of Islam lived together largely in a mutually beneficial relationship. That it's generally conceded by all observers was remarkably productive on both sides. That's the symbiotic side of it. That is, both gained by this relationship. In the first instance, a common way of constructing it is that in the first instance, Islam benefited from Judaism because they accepted a considerable amount of the salvation history as well as many particular traditions of the prophets, particular forms of ritual from Judaism, the obviously more ancient tradition, and many of the original converts to Islam were Jews who brought over their traditions, which were then Islamicized. And then after a few centuries, the Jewish community benefited from the enormous economic and cultural boom that came with the development of Islam. So while, again, I think you're all familiar with the more or less conventional historical picture, and that is that while Jews under Christianity in Europe were living in terrible conditions, the Jews under Islam were living in not only in generally very comfortable economic conditions. They enjoyed, for example, no sequestration, generally in Muslim cities, no geographic separation, but also no economic or occupational separation. So Jews and Muslims not only often lived near each other, but they even intermarried, formed business partnerships, spoke the same language, went to some of the same teachers, etc., etc. This is not, now, it's not, that's, all of that, of course, is not to say that it was a perfect picture, an ideal picture. Jews were second-class citizens in Muslim law. But certainly by comparison to the situation under Islam, it was considerably better. I think most scholars generally agree. Now, for me, and so much of in the first years of my scholarly life were devoted to detailed studies of various ways in which, very detailed studies in which various kinds of traditions, practices were borrowed, influenced, interchanged between Jews and Muslims. But for me, the really interesting question was one of the questions that's on the table here, and that is the trans-religious question, the trans-cultural question. One of the questions that really beset me, that really possessed me in much of this work, which is still my primary ongoing scholarly agenda, is to work in these relationships, was the question, if you will, of what you might call spiritual property. Who owns what when religions share so much? Now, from an exalted position, we might say, well, they both have the same and they share, and that's quite wonderful, but that's also quite idealistic. In practice, it seems to me there's a very interesting analytical question. When you have, in the sequence of monotheisms, a succession of revelations, right? You have Christianity comes first, then presumes to supersede Judaism, and Islam, the next step in the chain, again presumes to supersede Christianity and Judaism. The presumption of the successive revelations is that the older revelations are obsolete. They are no longer operative. God has sent a new message, and the older messages are now out of operation, so to speak. They've been succeeded. Well, you know, it turns out to be a much more difficult question than that, certainly, when the reality is that Jews and Muslims live together, work together, and it becomes much more complicated for the slightly later period, which is the one I'm primarily working on now, when Jewish philosophers and Jewish mystics and Muslim philosophers and Muslim mystics, particularly in the so-called Golden Age of Spain, met together and shared not just the, if you will, they're sometimes called the external forms of religion. That's one way of thinking about it, not just the surfaces of religion, which I actually think are the depths. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But also mystical beliefs, new mystical practices, and in fact, Sufism, the mystical practice and belief of Islam, and Kabbalah, the mystical belief and practice of Judaism, emerge as sibling traditions. The practitioners of philosophy and mysticism met together for centuries and shared what they understood to be their deepest truths. This much more radicalized and problematized the question that I put on the table.
There is no point.
No, that's fine.
The practice topic, kind of topic, but you won't put you higher than this. Just
No, that's fine.
I don't think
That's fine.
I'm sorry.
No problem. Right. And I can't preach without a pulpit. So these are some of the questions that I've been concerned with. Most of the work I'm doing right now concerns the 12th century, which is really the high moment of sharing, 12th and 13th century, the high moment of sharing. This is a time when the Kabbalah got started in Spain, and when Ibn Arabi in the 13th century, probably considered one of the greatest Muslim mystics, also emerged, and it's some of the same time and place. The point is that some of the most, perhaps the most profound mystical traditions of the two faith traditions emerged together in interaction, in a kind of cooperative might be too strong, but there was a certain awareness of each other. This is not insignificant because it raises, again, this question of spiritual property. Who owns what? Who owns the truth? It's a question that I think is not easily written off when we consider subsequent religious history. Who gets to own this stuff if it's really shared? Is it easy to say it's really shared? Or is it universal? These are some of the questions we've already put on the table. Now, that's the detailed historical work I had been accustomed to doing, particularly on the esoteric traditions between Judaism and Islam. And in doing so, my entire teaching career has been spent at a small liberal arts college. We call in the States a teaching college. We have no graduate students, and our primary mission is to teach small classes that are like graduate seminars. I'm going to have very talented undergraduate students. They pay $30,000 a year for this, and it's very intensive and a very rigorous kind of education. Because the two students are so good and have been, they're always pushing us to the edges of our capacities. The problem was that my edge turned out to be very clear, and that was that I never had quite understood what the category religion was. And so it was never really very easy for me I could descriptively separate, I knew who was a Muslim and I knew who was a Jew, okay? But as many of you know, the famous weasel word, religion, is not an easy one to get your hand on. As I taught many courses in various aspects of the study of religion, I had to engage the general thinkers, the great minds who made the fundamental contributions to what religion in general is. Okay? It just so happened that two of them, one was a master of Islamic studies, Henri Corbin, and another was a master of Jewish studies, Gershom Scholem. The master of general religious studies was Mircea Eliade. Now, I had known, and I taught all three of them every year for years, without quite understanding them. Being pushed by my students as I taught them to understand more clearly, I came to understand one simple thing, and that was they all knew each other well and had met each other for many years. From 1949 through 1978, they, on and off, went to Eranos, which met annually in Ascona and Lago Maggiore in Switzerland, which is had long been a center of avant-garde and bohemian artists and intellectuals in Europe. In the interwar period, it attracted many of the leading European intellectuals and artists from Kafka and Hesse and Jung. They all went to this little Swiss village. And in 1933, they established Eranos, this colloquium of historians of religions who have continued to meet there. The group is now somewhat disputatious. There are sort of two groups now vying. But in any event, they've continued to meet there since 1933. These three men met, they knew each other, their work was published by some of the same publishers, and they developed together what I now realize was a closely related, more general account of what religion is. Pushed by my students, I wrote this book to figure that out. The book is called Religion After Religion, Gershom Scholem, Mircea Eliade, and Henri Corbin at Eranos. And it's an attempt to look at the various ways in which they had a common theory of religion, and why it became, I think, probably the most influential theory of religion in the second half of the 20th century. This book was read down here by a few of you and came to your attention, and that's where I am now. What I want to do is suggest some ways of thinking about moving beyond that paradigm, which was the great I think, the great paradigm of thinking about religion in general in the last century. I'm certainly not attempting to overcome it fully, but these are some tentative probes. They're particularly stimulated not just from my teaching experience, but not just from the trenches of years of teaching and scholarship, but also because there is a crisis in religious studies internationally, a crisis of identity. Now this is probably because all the human sciences, so far as I know, are some sort of crisis of identity, and there are probably some good reasons for that, but religious studies most certainly has this problem now, and this, and what follows, is my modest attempt to address some of those questions in a tentative way. Let's do it. All religion is interreligion. That is, there is, so far as I know, no religious situation after the hunter-gatherer stage of social evolution, and except for exceptionally rare cases of total isolation, no religious situation that is not simultaneously a situation of interreligious contact. A Martian or an angel or whoever would hover above history witnessing believers at their rituals could not fail from an aerial perspective to notice the other believers down the street. Nor could those earthbound believers fail to notice their counterparts. While multiplicity of religions may be a social universal, however, recent cultural conversation has chewed only indecisively over the significance of interreligion, other than the obvious descriptive fact that there's lots of them. There was, to start with, the long, unsettled discussion of secularization, first stimulated by Max Weber, one of the dominant social science paradigms. We're all going to get less and less religion. Religion's going to go away, right? We're all going to become secular. Weberian secularization theory, to some considerable extent, ground abruptly to a halt with the Iranian Revolution of 1979. And very quickly, people stopped using secularization theory. They came to realize that religion wasn't going to go away. It was replaced as a topic of sociocultural concern by such tepid successors as invisible religion. These are some of the ideas that are percolating out there. Invisible religion, implicit religion, and civil religion. These are all different sociological designations. To these, after the 1970s, was added the clearly more significant problem of New Age religion and new religious movements, all of which blur the distinctions between religions. I myself have studied here something called religion after religion, and here the C-trans teams are also studying trans religion. The general phenomenon of interreligion then is familiar, if still conceptually fuzzy. This fuzziness is only partly due to the sheer rapidity of developments. Interreligion is being domesticated at a rate yet to be calculated. New religious movements by the thousands are based on it. And just in the last day or two, I've heard about several new ones down here, which are rather large. Religion, in the singular, so claims new religious movements, no longer resides exclusively within the self-inscribed precincts of one's own beliefs and practices. Religiosity, they say, the new religious movements say, transcends confessional limits. They cross the bounds of religions. Despite the gains made by new religious movements, interreligion still has a seemingly insurmountable problem. It flagrantly flouts the sine qua non of theology. the thing that makes theology theology, that revealed truth claims must be transcendentally validated and therefore simply are non-negotiable. Interreligion, in short, obviates absolutism. It seems to reject absolute claims to truth. Of course, this claim presents no small obstacle to its generalized acceptance on the part of those who represent established religions. This is all obvious. After all, theology at its bottom, at its origins, was a cognitive absolutism of sorts, and it remains at bottom an absolute theory of the absolute. Each theology, by definition, demands its own noble isolation, falling always back onto the refuge of incommensurability. Sorry about that. Very big word in the social sciences. Incommensurability. The welcome deadlock of opposition to revelational rivals. Retraditionalization, or sometimes called fundamentalism, is therefore the re-emerging of what really never left. This sustaining insistence that one's own revelation alone rules. The sovereignty of the unseen is owned only by the seer on our side. Projects of interreligion set obviously against this insistence, therefore create problems, even as they seem to solve others. In particular, they posit a transcendent essence, a distinctive religious reality, independent of any local manifestation in particular. But such trans-religious essentialism, as I have said, contravenes the singularity that each revelation assumes by definition. Interreligion, posited on such a trans-religious basis, would thus seem the quintessential enemy of any particular religion in the singular. So just introductory remarks. Let me complicate these uncontroversial historical and philosophical observations, however, with controversy itself, the contemporary political contentions over interreligious conflict, which we know all too well. This conflict arises independent of the truth as a war for the truth. There is today, in short, no political question more necessary and more impossible to contemplate than that of antagonistic revelations. Interreligion, in this sense, comprises a dominating dimension of contemporary religious life. Again, nothing new. To recapitulate the problem, the history of religions, my discipline, the history of religion seems stuck between religion and interreligion. I want to suggest a way out of this apparent impasse to start with. The phenomenon of prophecy, I've mentioned revelation a couple of times, itself may provide this point of departure. I'm going to stick primarily with what I know, with monotheism. In monotheistic doctrine of a certain sort, prophecy is closed. Period. Full stop. There's no more prophecy. A certain moment in history, you have the end of prophecy. But at the same time, Revelation defines itself by its actions in the plural. What I mean is that there's more than one prophet. There's a staggered sequence of communications, of revelations, one prophet following the last in some sort of meaningful sequence. Furthermore, the prophet's seemingly subjective assertion of revealed truth succeeds in being received. The prophet, however unpopular in his lifetime, breaks through from the subjective into the intersubjective, to that social agreement in which believers acclaim divine language to be divine. Now, this success of new prophecy is always the success of the old as well. That is to say, the epistemological inescapability of pattern recognition. We can only recognize that with which we are already familiar, requires acclamation of new revelations to be dictated by prior revelational frameworks. Now, this pattern incidentally holds true throughout religious history. Religious sites are always religious sites. So what was originally an ancient religious site then becomes a temple, and then at some point it's conquered, and a mosque is built on it, and then it's conquered, and a church is built on it. But that site, it's like a palimpsest. It's got one text on top of each other. It tends to remain, and it's the same way, I think, with Revelations as well. Prophecy proceeds, in other words, not only on a thinly pluralistic recognition that previous prophecies had come before, but more importantly, for the reason that listeners accept prophecies precisely because prophets construe the new in the mold of the old, both diachronically and synchronically. In short, religion is plural. Prophecy is plural. Nor is this is a quick sketch just to make a point, nor is this pluralism limited to revelations in antiquity. Even the shock of the modern can be defined as yet another stretching of the revelational envelope. At least it's marked by a stretching of that envelope, though in quite another sense. From the 16th century or so on, Rosicrucian and Masonic movements upheld the transconfessional as the residence of, the embodiment of, a permanent truth beyond the occasional hierophany, the occasional or local manifestation. They located a trans-religion, a general esoteric tradition across religious boundaries. The esoteric traditions started to teach this at ancient roots, of course. This pristine truth was claimed to pass through a trans-religious chain of transmitters. This claim and this chain then formed together the instigation for a new kind of enlightenment, sometimes called the counter-enlightenment. The result, the counter-enlightenment, was one avenue through which trans-religion first found its way into the public sphere. And we know that some of these movements had a very important impact on the rise of the revolutionary ideals in France and in the United States. Enlightenment and counter-enlightenment were closely related, and they both posited some kind of transgressing of traditional religious confessional limitations. They also stimulated, we believe, the scientific revolution. That's not my concern here. Let me just make one other point about it, and one that I develop more in my book, and that is that as it was with medieval mystics, so it was with moderns as well. Let me say just a word about this. like somebody's translating. Am I too loud?
No, not.
Shall I go on? One homology, one common pattern between, I might just point out, between the distance between the modern and the medieval is not always so great as is sometimes suggested, and I just discussed one in my book. And that is, and this is one that is developed by Eliade and Corbin and Scholem in various ways, and that is that the medieval mystics and the modern artists shared a certain kind of pattern, and that is they were a kind of avant-garde that breaks through. The notion of a breakthrough is, I think, an important way in thinking about the way certain radicalized medievals broke through and served as a pattern for modern artists, breaking through to a new creativity, to a new individuality, to a new kind of vision. In one sense, they broke through from one world age to the next, because they were the forerunners for new patterns in religion. The medieval mystics were, and that's, of course, the way some modern artists see themselves as well. And in another sense, they broke through from one old religion to a new world. That is a personal vision, hard-won in visionary experience. In this sense, contemporary interreligion continues both the commotion, that particularly in the part of individuals, continues the commotion of visionary reconfigurations and the turning of the world picture initiated in medieval mystical breakthroughs. In a sense, then, there's no problem after the collapse of modernisms, which many people think has now a fait accompli, the collapse of a cultural, aesthetic, and political modern movements. There's no problem in our period that is not also some kind of re-engineered interreligion. Identity, these are all the buzzwords we hear. Identity politics, the struggle of civilizations, the return of repressed fascisms, the rage to exterminate the pursuit of enlightenment happiness. All this current ardor aims to topple an already obsolete universalism, so the story goes. An abandoned meta-narrative, a grand theory of interreligion already run aground. One reason, as we all know, most currently, is that the revolutions in information and in communication and the digital revolutions shift the ground beneath our feet. From here, history of religions must pick itself up off the ground and run toward the horizon. That horizon that Augusti has quite properly pointed out we will never reach. It's an asymptotic process. We're never actually going to get there. To return then to the question of trans-religion. Is there still a science of such things, given these conditions? And is that science the history of religions? Can it still be? For one approach, let me start with, for a provocative approach, let me say, let me turn to briefly start with a controversy between two men in the 1930s, briefly in the 1930s. That was the constitutional jurist Carl Schmitt, who became the great crown jurist of the Third Reich, and Leo Strauss, a young philosopher in Germany who shortly thereafter emigrated to Britain and then the United States, where after the war he became leading political philosopher. Schmitt and Strauss engaged in a correspondence in the 1930s in which they both developed their famous theories, which were somewhat at odds with each other, although they had a common basis. Let me just make this point and see if it will be useful. Strauss, both of them, I think, had a similar base of shared concern. They were both concerned with the political. What is the political? Now, this is important, I think, and they're both getting much attention today because they both approach the political through the religious, although rather differently. That's why I'm bringing it up. Strauss developed at this time what he came to call, now famously, political philosophy. Political philosophy for Strauss was based on what he called the variety of divine laws. There's more than one divine legislation, and that's precisely what makes political life possible. It's an interesting concept. Let me just put it on the table, and I'll return to it. Meanwhile, Schmidt developed his political theology. Strauss was arguing for something he called political philosophy. Schmidt wrote something he called political theology. And his central concept was the friend-enemy relationship. Enmity was the key thing. Schmidt defines the political as enmity, as the friend-enemy relationship. Now, but they agreed on the centrality of the political as being intrinsically plural. The variety of divine laws, friend and enemy. Mutual exclusion, in other words, as first principle. Following Strauss and Schmidt, the plurality of revelations, I'm going to suggest, is the theologico-political predicament of the history of religions. I'll repeat that. The plurality of revelations is the theologico-political predicament of the history of religions. True, we try to avoid the rock of relativism and the hard place of syncretism. When we respect the distinctiveness of each revelation in its own terms, and most religion studies teachers make a lot of nice noises about that. And to study them in their own terms. Well, yes, of course, so we can't understand them if we don't study them in their own terms. But this nice navigating doesn't resolve the dilemma. We're still stuck with incommensurable absolutisms, each preaching to its own choir, each separated by abysses. This is not easy. Mere conversation, mere etiquette, while perhaps conducive to peacemaking, is still ultimately trivial. The historian of religions, trying to look past trivialities, should see in this situation not an either-or endgame, but rather a both-and opportunity. Since communication between exclusivisms is its business. For the history of religions, the theologico-political, that's not my phrase, that comes from Strauss, the theologico-political question can be restated as follows. Are only threatless irrationalities tolerable? Are the only serious irrationalities the threatening one? Let me take the example of human sacrifice that I threw out this morning, or clitorectomy that we talked about. Are all behaviors, all beliefs, and all practices tolerable? We can tolerate each other so long as they don't do violence? Is that the line in the sand? That as long as they're not threatening, as long as they're not doing violence? It's not obvious that that's the principle or the sole principle that we want to work with. I suggest that it might not be easy. To be sure, one's own home belief system provides, for most people, most of the time, the sole consummation of rational and irrational into the transrational. That's all they need, because they get that from their home tradition. They don't need to go somewhere else to have all those things converge into the transcendent. But what then do you respond as a good neighbor to your neighbor whose parallel transrational nomos, whose revelation commands her to fast during your feasts, or for you to feast during her fasts, which bothers a lot of people. We'll leave sacrifice aside. I propose, of course, no solution to this predicament, but given the inescapability of interreligion, we historians of religion have no choice but to embrace it as the baseline assumption of any self-aware study of religion. This assumption, perhaps, might be called deep pluralism. Deep pluralism is the serious study of interreligious processes, negotiations, as they reveal themselves routinely in human relations. History of religions traces the moving interface between irreconcilable opponents. That is, and it doesn't posit some idealized commonality. At least I don't think it should. The deep pluralism of history of religions, having no choice, must be predicated on enemy brothers, on a dialectic of enemies who may eventually reconcile. May. The model here for me is that of Franz Rosenzweig and Emmanuel Levinas, Jewish thinkers straddling each side of the Holocaust, who nonetheless constructed an ethics in open conversation with Christianity. To whatever extent the notion of revelation in the plural, is taken seriously as they did, to that extent it remembers that enemies do negotiate. And how should history of religions understand such negotiations? I'm going to use this big word. In the transdisciplinary space between history and philosophy. Now again, this is not much, there's nothing much new here in what I'm doing, just some reformulations. Eliade, for example, emphasized the historian of religions is has to be both a philosopher and a historian. It's not enough to describe. And we all know, anybody who teaches this stuff knows why. You don't know that religion does not exist out there in the world. We have categories. Religion, myth, ritual, the sacred, all these are categories we bring into the religions, but most of them don't reside in practice in the neighborhoods where we study particular belief and practice. Okay? So the historian of religions also has to have a philosophical conception of what religion is in its particulars. So history of religions really is a portmanteau kind of both philosophical and historical, and I concentrated in this last generation because I thought these were the greatest minds who did precisely this. That is, they both philosophically understood religion and objectively and descriptively engaged its details. So the dialectic of the historian of religions must be at once historical and philosophical. Its stuff, I suggest, is the historical dialectic of revelational divergence and negotiation. History of religions, quite simply, is that historical activity both descended from and reflecting on interreligion. Now, it will become a little clear why I keep emphasizing interreligion, because I think that interreligion is the primary reality of religious existence and not a myth, an experience, a sacred, or anything, any kind of singular totality that we can name. Theologians study history. Anthropologists read tribal life in kinship terms. The history of religions, true to its origins as comparative religion, that's what it's called in England, not only compares faith traditions, but also reflects on that comparison. It must compare historically and then reflect philosophically on the results of that comparison. For these reasons, history of religions is bound to play a leading role in clarifying trans-religion as a cultural process. though it can do so only if it takes revelation seriously enough to pit enemy brothers against each other in all their polemic and apologetic ferocity. None of this nice stuff. To reduce the, I mean, nice is nice. It's nice to be nice. But real interreligious interactions have to come in with the full confidence and depth of their own positions and understandings for the interaction to be serious, I believe, and therefore for the history of religions to understand it. To reduce the potency of these theological self-defenses is to minimize the civilizational self-sufficiency revealed respectively to these opposing traditions. Surrendering to this necessity, then, the new history of religions must abjure such prescribed choices between revelations. The abjure such prescribed choices is the characterization of Theodor Adorno of Carl Schmitt. He said, we don't need, it's not that we need to reify the notion of enemy, friend in the way that Schmitt did. That is, as an observer, it may focus on enemies, but without a preference for pacification or for enmity, which is what Schmitt did. It is concerned rather with difference, with the multiplicity of religions, and with the interfaces comprising that multiplicity. History of religions, by its very definition, seeks to understand religious reality in its plurality. To cite the old phrase, the watchword of the study of religion, to know one is to know none. To make matters worse, by its very character, history of religions possesses no defining method of its own. It's a general problem in the social sciences. But it knows, I think mine anyway, knows what it is not. History of religions rejects both existentialism and positivism. I think many of us agree on this. Both emotive and purely logical criteria as exclusive guides to meaning. I don't know many serious historians of religions who think you can have a purely scientific, that is a purely scientistic, logical approach to religion exclusively, or a purely emotional one. That is to say, we historians of religions reject the persuasions of mere vision equally with all incomprehending scientisms, to be distinguished from science. Indeed, instead, without a distinctive method of its own, the Transdisciplinary Commission of History of Religions is to sponsor encounters between philosophical claims to truth and historical claims to power. Here precisely may be the axis alone capable, I think, of catalyzing a new history of religions. On the one hand, naturalistic explanations of religious phenomena suffice only. Now I'm talking about two ends of the controversy raging in the study of religion. You have on the one end people who you might say espouse naturalistic explanation, right? Social science explanations suffice exclusively for them. At the other end, you have people who believe that the insider's view of religion, a theological faith immersion, is what it's required to understand religion. And it would appear that these two kinds of ways of thinking about religion, one which seeks to explain religion, one that seeks to understand religion, have no common ground. Stuck betwixt and between, lacking the undiluted support either of reason or of revelation, it would seem that there is no middle arena in which history of religions suffices. In fact, I think it is the hinge, the interface, the relational itself, the very notion of a middle position that provides the possibility and the necessity of the history of religions. Interreligious contact itself provides all the stuff we need. When it comes to historical exempla of philosophical incommensurates, here only history of religion suffices. I think it's the best place to talk about the way in which religions interact. History of religion seeks or should seek the deep meaning of such superficial pluralisms. There is virtually no religious situation that is not a situation of contact, and no history of religions that does not make sense of contact. And no history of religions does not make sense of contact, yes. Diametrically distinct then from the myth of myth, by which I mean the fatally flawed fantasy of a traditional world in which religions existed sacrally in their isolation. I think this is a myth. That is, it's historically not true. So far as we know, communities were always in contact with each other. The real, in fact, locates its fate only through orienteering the thick atmosphere of complicated relations. Take the example of witchcraft. History of religions cannot decide if witches fly. Big question. Do witches fly? Practitioners say they fly, right? It's a paradigm case. You can be a scholar of religion and study witchcraft, and you can say, humans can't fly, except in American Airlines or whatever, British Air. Humans can't fly, period. We all know why. Humans can't fly. Case closed. You take a chemical, you believe you fly, you fast long enough, you put your head between your knees, you have a shamanic experience. That's what really happens. Well, the problem, of course, is, and anthropologists have been struggling with this for a long time, is they say they fly. You're interested in taking them seriously. That's what your business is, right? You're supposed to spend your lifetime understanding these folks. They're saying they fly. You're saying they don't fly. Are you taking them seriously? It's a bind. It's not just a logical paradox, and it's certainly not a game. It's, I think, the most serious kind of question. It's a constantly chewing. And I don't think we can decide if witches fly. But we can take positions, certainly, but we can thickly explicate friendships between spellcasters and hex makers. That is, we can locate witches as neighbors, and we can describe their own assertions, so we can describe their own communities, and we can empathetically enter into their worldview. Is this a relapse into mere humanism? It's a nasty word. Is it a demystification? Another nasty word. And for these scholars, demystification was a bad thing. You want to retain the mystique of religion. Is it a failure of nerve? Is it only an obsolete historicism in a new guise? Such reproaches may prove valid. Only, I think, if history of religions doesn't understand witches, doesn't really try to understand the witch, doesn't really try to get inside the world of the witch. That is, if it persists in underestimating the fullness of the human, both psychological and social. So long as we know little about what individual and collective human life is really like, we might have continued as we had been doing in the last century. You remember that old century. Rather blithely rejecting, reifying the sacred and myth and the like. Everybody's got a myth. Everybody's got a sacred. And case closed. Worse of all, we might persist in imagining that religions are monads, sufficient unto themselves, which is what the theologians largely teach. I am impelled at this point to commit a truism. And this, I'm going to use a word that's come up a lot. What we historians of religion seek, what science seeks, what we must agree is the object of all serious inquiry is the real. This truth is self-evident, that religious... Well, we'll get into that. That religious realities, preeminently the venerated symbol systems, are real. Whether the realities is another question. A history of religions committed to the completest representation of social reality seeks to see systems, environments, organizations, organisms as they exist in process. Not self-enclosed monads, but social ecologies in which religious individuals and collectives operate as biological organisms do, ecologically. Religions are the original artificial life, and the new history of religions is work rendering both that originality and that artifice conscious. Visions, revelations, ascents to heaven, transforming angels, remaking our moral universe are more than shards of antiquated verse. These figures stalking toward us out of the foggy dew of syntax and neurology do indeed speak. They're not just functions of language or of brain chemistry. Hamlet's soliloquy, to be or not to be, conveys a death that threatens more than any iron hammer can. But it would seem obvious to the critic that this threat remains rhetorical, unreal, merely dramatic. History of religions steps in here to assert, and I think one of the great pioneers here is Henri Corbin, to assert the sovereignty, I'm putting it in different terms than him, the sovereignty of artifice. Myth, symbol, all the figures of prophetic imaginations are real in the realization. As memes, they grow on their own as collective representations, spreading intersubjectively, alive in the life that is transmission and reception, and transmission again. What makes the sovereignty of art pressing here is the dialectic of appearance and disappearance. That is, imaginal worlds, visions and angels and figures from the other world represent something. They make absence present. As such, they are much in need just now. Because what merely ironclad reality itself has to offer seems, to some serious observers, almost evanescent. And I leave this, of course, to those of you who deal with cyberspace to know exactly where it is we're disappearing into. But we are melting in some sense. That is, the very constitution of the human is in some sense fragmentary and increasingly under contention. Angels may be, Pierre Levy suggests, collective intelligences of a sort, and that may be just a rhetorical change. But our cultural expressions are taking on new meanings, just as the more secure meanings are evaporating. Reality is up for grabs to some extent. The culture of vision now becomes the vision of culture renewed. Untouchable as it is certain, the religiously real thereby remains a human reality. My point, finally, is that we've hardly taken the depth and breadth of the human seriously yet. The seriousness of our figures, what we've called collective representations, projections, angels, shadows, symbols, must be reconsidered in the light of our contemporary circumstances. I think this is the work of the new historian of religion. To achieve this deepening, we would need in the arena of the history of religions a deep naturalism. Addressing this, that is not a naturalism as we've seen, but a different kind of naturalism, I think, one that's going to follow wherever it is that we seem to be going now with the new technological and scientific changes. no choice we have. Addressing this need implies a turn toward the processes, psychological, biological, and social, that gave and keep giving revelations. This turn equally then implies a swerve away from the text of the revelation, which is the old model of studying religion, as well as from the tradition of commentary on the revelation, text-based, older style of studying religion. It's not that that goes out the window. Taking seriously does not mean taking literally. In fact, to take seriously is to accept for interpretation every available level of behavior, expression, belief. But the available levels are available on the surfaces, at least until we have exhausted those surfaces. What I'm suggesting now, following Leo Strauss and following Jonathan Z. Smith, who's a leading historian of religions in the United States, is that we can't opt, I suggest, for the surface, for the depths, until we've studied the surfaces. And the surfaces mean lived human life, real human ritual, human practice, as it's lived in real human conditions. As Leo Strauss put it, the problem inherent in the surface of things, and only in the surface of things, is the heart of things. Jonathan Z. Smith has predicated his history of religions on the study of these surfaces. Now, this is in tune, I think, with other developments in the other historical and social sciences. This deep superficiality means, in the first instance, a close attention to detail, even to seeming minutiae. In tune in the historical profession with what is called microhistory, and in Germany Alltagsgeschichte, and in anthropology with thick description. History of religions is turning micrological, as religion itself is taken apart in the act of close analysis and interpretation, as tiny as we can conceivably go into human life. The moment requiring such a turn to the tiny is the moment of the marvel, the routinization of the visionary. Visionary, I don't think is very unusual anymore. To take seriously the visionary, you see it on TV all the time. To take seriously I turned on the cable TV last night and there was a satanic ritual on the whole thing. Turn the channel and you see how these fantastic visions of other planets colliding. And on the next channel you've got 100 channels like this. You have vision after vision after vision. It's just not having visions is not such an extraordinary thing the way it used to be. To take seriously the visionary rather than the vision is not to deprive revelation of all its privileged role. Yes, it would be fatuous to deny the spectacular capacities of naturalistic explanation, and I don't think we should minimize them. But the relation between nature and the human is blurring beyond traditional recognition, leaving older modes of explanation panting for breath. The problem, quite simply, is that we are confronted with the hyper-real. Now let me ask you to imagine the following scenario, one which is not far off. And I know that there's quite a bit of activity in Brazil and new religious movements. When I get off the plane back in Oregon, I'm going to be teaching a seminar this summer on new religious movements. I want to say a few words about them. Let's imagine a new initiation. It used to be in the older traditions the significant mode of entry into the visionary, into the to the most elevated experiences was initiatory. You had to find a master somehow who could bring you in, who could teach you that tradition, right? Today you can go in the spiritual marketplace to a teacher who can give you a very, powerful, transformative initiation. You can first of all take a synthetic designer drug, which is not hard to find, which can manipulate your consciousness in many different ways. My students, 19-year-olds with access to a university or college chemistry laboratory after hours, can make you any drug you want. They can do anything to your head that you want. You can then be taken by this teacher and immersed digitally. Let's take the example of what was already an older scenario, the solar temple in Europe and in Canada. They had an underground multimedia chamber in which one went through a kind of multimedia transformative initiation experience. And then you could be, you have to get inside the mindset of a guru who would do this to you. And then you could be reconfigured. That is, you could be reprogrammed or brainwashed. Many people who study new religious movements don't use the terms brainwashing or reprogramming now because they're out of style, but that's not the point. You can, in any event, you can reconfigure someone through such experiences. And my point, through such an initiation, you can make myth live. You can enter a new world, a transformative world. I don't think this is a small matter. Somebody with sufficient means can take over an impoverished village in Ukraine or in other parts of the world. An international new religious movement, this is happening already. Take over third world areas which have no other defenses, and you come in with a multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar organization from the developed world. And you can do a lot of things to a lot of people. I don't think this is a minimal, it's not a joke. Now that's a scenario. How far off that is, I don't know. It may be that some of these initiatory scenarios will simply operate as games. In any event, to the extent I think that they will succeed, and some of them are going on even as we speak, they replicate our plasticity, our capacity to change. Salvation oscillating with damnation experimentally, in miniature. Myth no longer as sacred narrative, but as transformative theme park ride. This is what the hyperreal makes possible. The older history of religions could not see this initiation coming. They were born in the 19th century or shortly after the turn of the century. The technophobia of Eliade, Heidegger, and other post-Nietzscheans prognosticated, like good visionaries, some impending transformations, if only in the darkest shapes. Some of them perceived technology skulking as a kind of antichrist. As the guise modernity dawns in its determination to extirpate traditional life. The irony of their misperception is that technology's roller coaster is indeed now depriving us of a firm humanity on which to sustain any firm reaction to it. In other words, they took technology too seriously and not seriously enough. In 1979, we thought the Iranian, now I'm going to go into a few more trivialities. In 1979, we thought the Iranian Revolution was the major moment of our religious times. Wow. Well, the Iranian Revolution, the most unanimous revolution of modern times, return of this massive country to religion, and suddenly then the return of fundamentalisms around the world looked like a turning point. And then in 1989, a whole new world fell into place again. The fall of the Iron Curtain, fall of apartheid, seemingly overnight. What could be, and there are other major changes, dramatic changes around that time that happened in this part of the world. What could be more momentous? How could these enormities possibly be topped? And then they were, with the digital revolution that broke around us around 1995 or so. Suddenly, every corner of the world was touched and every tiny aspect of life transformed. I come to Sao Paulo, every other sign is for internet. When I first got here, I saw AOL. Oh, that's okay, America Online. That's what we would expect. Should be all right. But then there's BOL and UOL, right? And then all these other internet service providers and all these other signs everywhere, just for telecommunications. Suddenly, every corner of the world is touched and every tiny aspect of life transformed. The remarkable work of the School of the Future, which I read before I came down here, the long-distance learning. To me, I find it staggering, the way that geographic distance can be erased. I just find it tantamount to I find it really quite remarkable. But that's a routine thing we're doing, and that's happened in historical terms almost overnight. The brain is being colonized as an object of inquiry. Genetics are releasing changes as little comprehensible as they are resistible. Our notion of nature and experience of human limitations may never be the same again. And that's why certainly for any transdisciplinary project, I think you've got to get biologists on board, people who can talk about these kinds of changes. Suddenly, in other words, these prodigious waves of revolution, the religious, the political, and the digital, open human possibility again. And the latest revolution is the most total, swamping its predecessors, I believe. Suddenly, digitalized marvels, whether at the stellar or at the molecular levels, are released from the brain, hatched from the functional infinity of synaptic connections, made magnificent, ordinary in the everyday. We see visions again, in short. This is no longer the age of the fantastic, when the uncanny articulated a social condition. I think the fantastic was a certain kind of film and literature and poetry that was distinctive for an earlier generation, when reality was mixed and uncertain and it was uncanny. You weren't sure which world you were in. Today, I think it's something different. It's something like the age of the marvelous, or the heightening of the hyper-real. Again, it's ordinary to talk about this, nothing extraordinary already. Marvels, enormities are normal now. They're on TV. The age of the marvelous, in fact, may have begun with the first televised lunar landing. By now we are so conditioned, if not numbed, to the marvels, that they can, every day you read in the paper a new, the genomic code is cracked. Oh, that's just today's paper. If not numbed, by now we are so conditioned, if not numb to the marvels, that they scarcely seem marvelous at all. Still, our marvelous visions are not merely human, nor are they all too human. They are, to be sure, only meaningful if they remain recognizably human. At the same time, only continuously meaningful so far as they expand the meaning of the species. As we watch marvels wash over us, we are no longer experiencing social change as crisis. Certainly, we have crises, serious crises. But the generalized condition we talk about is not crisis, certainly in the States. Not crisis, but entertainment. There are no small ethical dangers and rational paradoxes posed by this serious new game. That's why the half-joking scenario of initiation is quite serious, because these transformations will come as games, and they'll come as entertainment. And they'll use the techniques of theme parks and computer games. They already are. Invoke the title of one book, The Entertainment State, which is what America is. Life is a movie, which is what our cultural condition is. And little kids grow up all the time. My children already did. They pick up an object and they say, many of you have had this experience, is this real, Daddy? Because they don't know often the simulacra of the things around them are so lifelike, so real, seemingly real. They don't know whether they're real or not. They have to be taught what's real and what's not. And new religions, preying on the anomie spread by overstimulation, offering digitalized initiation into a new myth, these cynical titillations are not likely to lighten their knife-edge intensities anytime soon. All the while, unreality, numb, dumb, and anomic, keeps returning us to reality inverted. Television, internet, wireless, cable, electronic books, very close already. You're going to own one book. It's going to have a supple electronic page. You can program whatever book, whatever your daily periodicals, as well as whatever other classics you want into it. Technology is at hand. I read 2 articles about the development of this technology just in the last week. Simultaneously expand, imagine you can have your whole library in your pocket. Simultaneously expand and contract our boundaries, even invert them. The digitalized expanses of an emerging collective intelligence is half blinded by bedazzlement and half blinded by the ennui of seeing it all. Too much and too little, with too little between. The whiplash of these oscillations characterizes our half-crazed condition. The scale has changed. We are turned inside out, if not fully inverted. Where there were deeps are now surfaces, and vice versa. I'm coming to the end. It's taking a little longer than I thought. My apologies. Deep naturalism, deep pluralism, deep superficiality. I've introduced these terms. Presume, of course, the category deep, so I should speak to it. By deep, I mean a modestly relational term. Deep merely in the sense of deepened. And what does it mean to deepen? Here, again, our age of the marvel must be kept in mind. Inversion of scale, brought on by quantum mechanics and by the more recent developments in physics and nanotechnology and genomics, and the attendant shock of recognition as microscopic worlds swim newly blinking into our ken, now large enough to loom unavoidably, micro and thick, the infinitesimally textured surface of ordinary life is not a scruffy substructure to which we would reduce exalted religion. I'm going to repeat that because I think it's a point I want to really emphasize. The claim was in the old historians of religions that reductionism was bad. Reductionism meant that you were reducing something high, ideal, and exalted to something merely ordinary, social life, your sexual life or your economic life, what Freud did and Marx did, right? Bad, because it's reducing something expansive and transcendent to something merely ordinary and everyday, a generalized notion. I think it's just out the window now. What we call the ordinary life ain't what it used to be. It seems to me such a whole new world that we can't minimize what the ordinary is until we really understand what ordinary experience is. And doing that, we might then begin to understand what historical experience really was. Rather, it is the dream combed across waking routine, hyperreality, that demands this new deepening. The scale has changed and we are forced to make meaning where we find it. What would be the alternative? What choice do we really have? We have changed, and so we can view history anew, not only with new tools and new questions, but with a heightened appreciation for the heights of the everyday, of religious people meeting and mating and never exhausting the tragic richness of the lived given. What we can now look back with into history is not a finer idealism, not a fancier world theory, not a searing illumination or an explanation to end all explanations. What we can do is start from our century, all this that transforms our perceptions, to try our hand at history again. I'm sorry, I'm an American, I'm a pragmatist. Crisis, my conclusions. Crisis was our 20th century condition. But now the normal enormity has replaced that everyday condition. It's still crisis for millions, of course. A numbed but frenzied conditioning to ordinary impossibilities. I walk around with this Palm Pilot in my pocket. What's it got, 8 megabytes? It's staggering. 8 megabytes in your pocket, and that's nothing, because soon it's going to be 16. What's that?
Magic.
It's like magic, right? Accordingly, what we need is not some tepidly liberal ecumenicism. We're all nice. Let's be nice to each other. But rather, the moral equivalent of crisis consciousness appropriate to our aestheticized and hyper-stimulated times. William James, pragmatist, who called for the moral equivalent of war exactly a century ago, championed what he called a radical empiricism. And this call was advanced by none other than the Jewish theologian and one of my heroes, Franz Rosenzweig. I add that what I'm calling extreme empiricism is not to be mistaken for a radical historicism. I'm not suggesting reduce everything to history, reduce everything to the human. That really wouldn't get us very far. Brain sciences, artificial life, artificial intelligence, neural networkings, collective intelligence, cloning, nanotechnology, advanced robotics continue to accelerate the rate of their own advances. In response, any serious religious empiricism of this actual civilizational situation must acknowledge that human self-definition is itself unfolding into an almost miraculous remaking of itself. Just now, as we thus slide in irreal slow motion in the light of glowing self-awareness into this transhuman condition, history of religions must finally become a fully human science. In fact, as social sciences have always insisted, only by taking seriously the deeps of naturalism, the natural facts of our lives, can we plumb the fullness of the human. Deep naturalism means that the ancient hidden recesses should be scrutinized. It does not assume that we can reach bottom. Deep naturalism, in fact, is a naturalism without bottom. The trap door on the stage of history will remain open to the possibility that some director is down there still at work. But deep naturalistic explanations suspend the belief in the end of depths. We plumb depths, but bracket the bottom. Like deep pluralism on the social level, deep naturalism on the biological level brackets the deeps of revelational claims. We just bracket it. We can't say what we can know and not know. We have to be agnostic about that. Ours, therefore, is a humanism, recognizably continuous with previous projects of the human. This new humanism, however, is extreme, as Emmanuel Levinas has put it. Extreme humanism feels its fallible way towards a deepened philosophical anthropology, towards a new and fuller understanding of what it is to be human, as something Eliade called for. As an empiricism, it starts from the facts. In this case, the facts of the new human, possessed, yes, of the old rationality and the same old ethics, but new
to the exponential increases in information overload, to the cyber-spatialization of time and the trans-temporalization of space, so to speak. Confronted with these stimuli, we cannot be content unless history of religions continues to widen the area of consciousness, to explore all available dimensions of the human, to submit to the demands of our moment with neither faddishness nor foolish utopianism. Humanism continuous is not anti-religious, but neither can it be enamored of spiritual progress, not after the last century. My conclusion. Religion after religion starts from the end of history, and its science, history of religions, similarly begins from interreligion as a given. Beginning here, only a transdisciplinary deepening will now make humanistic sense of this, our given, our perplexing hyper-reality. The new history of religions is the extreme humanism raised on and thus conditioned to trans-religion. The present hyper-real inversion of surfaces especially sensitize it to the deep surfaces of the past. The deep past of religions, the still unstudied history of religions, will be found on the surfaces of ritual, practice, the usual, and the routine. This rediscovery of the ordinary will surprise us insofar as we can feel in it the deepnesses of the real, deeply textured surprises like those hiding now around us on the surfaces of the hyperreal. Thank you. Sorry that took so long.
Thank you.
Do I have this?
Thank you, Stephen, for this fabulous show. I must say that I enjoyed very much your talk as a kind of fabulous joke with a fabulous talent. I don't know what Ruth Escobar thinks. She was just near, because as an actor must be extraordinary, but I'm not competent to judge. So I don't know in this atmosphere if I can put a serious question, if I'm allowed. So I put a serious question if you allow me.
You don't think I'm serious?
No. I mean, I will not be at the level of the highest level of talent to enjoy this show. So
you're patronizing me.
No. So the question is the history of religion like we describe now, this means in June 2000, a branch of sociology? Is that a branch of psychology? Is that a branch of social psychology? With a branch of psychosociology? And I will have 2 short comments after the answer.
That's my choice? Those are my choices?
No, you have an infinite others, like in the supermarket of answers.
Why? I described what I thought. I think it's going to be...
I didn't understand what you described as sociology. Sorry,
social facts. I never said it was sociology.
Yeah. Of course, because you'll destroy your discipline if you say that. But what you describe factually look like sociology. Anyway, that's also my feeling. So you say it's not sociology because you define religion as based on interreligion, right? Okay, I will say is logical, what we call in logic a vicious circle. How you can define religion by a word which includes religion? It's nonsense. So, okay, that's a remark.
I'm not a logician.
Sorry?
I'm not a logician.
No, but it's obvious that it's a vicious circle, right? You can say religion is based on interreligion because the word interreligion contains religion. So this is called a vicious circle, right? Okay, anyway. But if it's your definition, that's okay. I mean, the community. Is the community who is you? Is the community who is saying that?
It's, first of all, it's not.
No, it's the community of history.
Wait, you one point at a time. It's not a definition. It's
It's
just
based what?
It's a characterization.
Well, it's a vicious circle. You can say it's based on interreligions. A comment now on reductionism. You said that the criticism of reductionism is now out of window. I think you are really too fast, and it's not serious, really, because you confuse two levels of the word reductionism. The method of reduction was always present in science forever, from when science is science, even before modern science, as a method. This means bringing A to B, B to C, C to D, and so on, right? Quantum physics is reductionistic in this sense. Any science, any rational discourse, if it's not reductionistic, is nonsense as a method. But this is to be distinguished from ideology of reductionism. And what means ideology of reductionism? To have structures which are extremely rich, and to reduce that to building blocks which from where you cannot find the totality. That's the ideology. It has nothing to do with the scientific method. So I think what is out of window is the ideology. And the criticism was always about ideology, not, at least for serious people, not for writers, not for journalists. Okay?
I'm not following you. So what reductionism is in...
I say that reductionism is basic in any science from when science in science. Reductionism means reductio in Latin, means to bring A to B, B to C, C to D, and so on. Okay.
Right, and
so quantum physics is reductionist. Anything is reductionist which is rational, but as a method.
But the critique of reductionism that you're referring to, for example, in Eliade, which he was famous for...
was for ideology of reductionism.
Okay.
Not for the method. Eliade, sorry, probably I knew Eliade better than you, okay? And only 15 years ago, I had discourses about history of religion from Eliade. And okay, we shifted in another century, of course, now. So, okay, it's a huge shift, I understand. But he never criticized the reductionism as a method, because he always claimed to be a scientist. He claims history of religion, as you know, to be a science, which made me a little bit laugh, but still I accept it.
Boa tarde. Sorry. A questão seguinte que eu queria colocar para você em particular é o processo das religiões nasciam de uma pessoa especial, ou seja, ela era uma coisa absolutamente básica de ser humano para ser humano. E ela dependia de uma pessoa que tivesse experiências transcendentais. E essa pessoa detinha em si a informação do bom viver, de como viver dentro de umas leis éticas, morais, onde o processo de viver seria absolutamente feliz e contemplativo. O fato em si, se naqueles espaço-tempos esse intérprete detinha a informação e a comunidade reconhecia nele um valor de ideal, hoje o que a gente não tem de verdade é o intérprete e a gente substitui a experiência transcendental por algo fora da gente. A minha pergunta é a seguinte: será que de repente esse dilúvio de informação, essa capacidade da gente estar vivendo a informação externa, ou seja, a gente vive de memória RAM, mas de memória hard disk, de memória interna, para onde a gente pode passar a ir dentro desse estado, quando na verdade a gente não tem mais condição de reconhecer o profeta? Porque como a gente perde o individualismo a partir dessa massificação, e as sociedades antigas conseguiam ter alguma condição de individualismo para perceber esse possível Messias, como a gente consegue hoje provavelmente organizar uma religião para essa ser o padrão ético vigente dentro de uma sociedade informatizada, perdão. A ideia é tentar achar esse ponto comum para a gente tentar se situar. pergunta, ou nem sei se é uma pergunta.
Well, let me address the question of how we identify a prophet, how we identify a Messiah. Make a couple observations on it. First, for every prophet, there's 1 million people, right? For every Messiah, there's 10 million followers. Second of all, I think that the problem, it's, I think, quite clear with the very rapid and very serious emergence of new religious movements. The problem of identifying who is an authentic prophet or not, which was a traditional religious problem, is taking on a whole new political and social life. That being said, I'm just a historian. I'm not a prophet. I have no answers in particular. These are really nothing more than modest suggestions for a different emphasis in how we go about studying and the kinds of things we might go about studying and what we might go about emphasizing in doing history of religions. I think that it will be significant that we have a very new situation today, and that should help us think about the past. But I don't think that the past necessarily gives us any particular guidance in making critical decisions, unfortunately, about today. We know that about history. I'm just a historian. Historians don't necessarily give us very much guidance, unfortunately, about a contemporary situation. Sorry.
With reference to Islamic studies, Henri Corbin implies in one of his books, in order to understand better the esoteric experience of the Shiite, that it has been possible because in the Islamic faith, religion has never been separated from philosophy. And this seems to me of particular interest to us here because it gives us an idea of this wonderful possibility of this mystic experience. Why did the Islamic faith develop this wonderful ability? Was it purely through the esoteric experience? And what is it over the siècle, over the centuries, that has pushed these people on to such an extent? The Sufi and the Shiite have developed and continue to develop. Now, why is this? Is this because there is no separation? There never was? I mean, I don't know about the Islamic faith today, but Henri Corbin, he states it very clearly, there was never any separation. And he develops this wonderful idea of this creative vision and the mondo imaginaris, that for us, I think it's a wonderful study that we can make. His whole book and this whole idea, but what do you think of this idea of never a separation between religion and philosophy, the way the Christian faith had it with the scholastic theories?
That precise question is where most of my detailed Orientalist work in fact resides today. Now, so I could say many things about it. Let me try and be as brief, as I know our time is up. Let me try and be as brief as I can. One, Corbin was a great genius, and what he did was retrieve a very extremely complex and stunning, moving interpenetration between philosophy and mysticism, and one the traditional Orientalists tend to neglect, right? A long Neoplatonic and visionary tradition, largely in the Iranian orbit, that he was the great master of. I think he was a tremendous poetic spirit. I don't, however, think that his explanations of why that tradition was so great and why it was neglected by modern scholarship is at all adequate for me. And let me give you a few examples. It's beautiful to talk about the mundus imaginalis, and the poet in us, I'm a poet as well, poet in us is very moved by that. And I've learned a lot as a poet from Corbin, who understood vision and understood the creative imagination, I think, as much as anybody did. But there's a lot of other ways of talking about what happened there without talking about the mundus imaginalis. There were major demographic changes. There were people who met and taught each other in certain ways. There were forms of initiation. There were specific practices. There were many, many other things that went into the development of that tradition that Corbin has no interest in. And he severely distorts that tradition. I know of almost no scholars of that tradition today who respect what Corbin did. I'm very sorry, I know there are a lot of Corbin lovers here. But I know the Islamicists, and they're very few, except for a few who are involved with mysticism in a direct way, who think that Corbin is very useful, whose distortions are not greater, I'm sorry to tell you this, than historical distortions were not greater than the gains that were made. Nobody doubts that his learning, nobody doubts his genius, nobody doubts that he initiated us into new worlds in important ways. But there's a vast continent of specific study on those texts and those practices that he completely ignored. He had no interest in, and people today, Iranian scholars and historians, there's a vast new collection of studies in Sufism, the history of Sufism. Corbin is in there not almost very, very little, because people today are reading the texts in the original and going into the organization of Sufi orders